welcome to the AFERM podcast. I'm your host, Paul Marshall. Thanks for joining us on our inaugural podcast. Today, we'll be speaking with Chief Risk Officer at the IRS, Tom Brandt. Tom, good morning.
Good morning, Paul. How are you today?
Good. Thanks for joining us today on our inaugural podcast for risk management.
It's my pleasure, and thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. Well, let's get into a little bit about your role over at the IRS. I think it's known in the federal space that you have one of the more mature implementations at this point, and you're definitely beyond the basics. So we would be interested to hear about what are some more advanced techniques, so to speak, that you all are utilizing over there.
Great. Yeah, I think we're actually moving into our fifth year of implementation of ERM at the IRS, which it's a bit hard to believe it's actually been that long already. But I'd say where we're at today is we have moved beyond sort of the basics of putting in place a risk register and I think identifying top risks and I think some of the risk reporting. And where we've actually moved into is articulating our risk appetite. So last year, working with the executive team, we did develop a written risk appetite statement, which actually is reflected in our current strategic plan. And I think moving on from that as well, we've begun to focus on developing key risk indicators, or what we call enterprise risk indicators. So looking at sort of our top risks, what are some of the metrics that we can track and look at that can give us an insight onto when a risk might be getting worse, or maybe, I think some insight on where we need to probably pay closer attention. And then, of course, I think the other key element, too, is moving beyond just identifying your top risks and focusing on risk mitigation. Mm-hmm. And so that's something where our Executive Risk Committee has been working with what we call accountable parties. Those are units that are assigned responsibility for some of our top enterprise risks, and actually working with them to look at what are our current mitigations. Mm-hmm. Are we comfortable that that's, I think, a sufficient risk response? And then are there areas where either additional investment or additional support from the Executive Risk Committee would be helpful, I think, in terms of addressing some of the challenges or risks around our top challenges.
Right. So how much do you, as the Chief Risk Officer, get involved in those specific conversations of the responses? What's your role in that exactly?
I facilitate that discussion with our Executive Risk Committee, which is, I chair that, and then the members are our 2 deputy commissioners, and then we have 5 executives who serve in rotational capacity. We meet quarterly, and then in the summertime, we may actually meet more frequently as we're doing our annual enterprise risk assessment. And that's where we'll invite executive leads on different risks to come in and I think talk to the risk committee around our current risk response and get a sense of how comfortable is the executive team that response is within the agency's risk appetite.
Okay, so that makes sense. So facilitation, getting everybody together. And actually back to the risk appetite, how did you guys develop that? And what was involved in that?
Well, I think every organization, whether they articulate it or not, has a risk appetite, and it really just reflects how comfortable the organization is in taking risk and what types of risk maybe are they going to be a bit more open to, and then some of those where they might be a bit more risk averse, for example. Mm-hmm. We started with our Executive Risk Committee in developing some options and socialized that a bit, I think with different parts of the organization. And then we brought it to our senior executive team, which is the heads of all the units at the IRS, as well as the IRS commissioner last summer, got their input, and then ultimately settled on, a risk appetite statement that acknowledges that, any organization, and in particular the IRS, to do our business, we have to accept risk. Mm-hmm. But there are some areas where we're especially sensitive to risk, for example, protecting data, taxpayer rights, et cetera. And so those are areas where we're going to be much more cautious.
Right, for sure. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Makes sense.
Okay.
Well, and let me ask you more about the culture of ERM at the IRS. Now that it's been going on for at least 5 years here, what would you say is the culture? Is leadership really involved, is ingrained with them? Do they use it for strategy, for budget?
Yeah, so, this is an area where I think we have also made really good progress, is in terms of, I think, integrating the consideration of risk into our day-to-day activities, and also, I think, changing just the overall way in which we approach risk. And so as an example, yesterday, my office, hosted a CPE for all IRS executives on where we're at with ERM. And I'm pleased to say that our IRS commissioner or acting commissioner opened that up, and we probably had more than 2/3 of our executive team that participated in that, both remotely and in person. Wow. I think that's a strong indication of their interest and support in the program, but I think as the acting commissioner noted yesterday in his remarks, he's seen, I think lots of evidence of where risks are being openly raised and discussed throughout a number of areas, and I think initiatives with the IRS, and of course the one that he's most attuned to right now is tax reform.
Okay, yeah, and that definitely brings up the question. I was curious about some of the biggest emerging risk areas that are happening at the IRS right now, and that's one of them, correct?
Yeah, tax reform obviously is probably one of our most significant risks at the moment, because there's just so much that needs to be done in a very short time to implement that new law. That includes updating guidance, issuing new forms, system changes, and then I think doing outreach. We have to train our workforce on the new provisions. So there are a number of risks that we've already identified and are working to address, but then there's some sort of risks further down the road that are going to take a bit more time to really understand, I think, the scale and the scope. And that, for example, may just be, how do people respond to the tax reform changes? Are there areas where we need to be a bit more concerned about potential non-compliance or even just uncertainty? In some of the provisions, there is a bit of uncertainty or where things could be a bit clearer, and I think that's where guidance comes in. But of course, companies and businesses are already in the midst of carrying out their business activities now. So I think it creates some challenge in ensuring that we've got the guidance out timely, and then taxpayers are able to actually plan their business activities with that in mind.
Right. And just a little bit more on that. So when you look at something like tax reform, it's coming. So how soon do you prepare for that? And what are some of the things you do to prepare to speak about those risks? And
Yeah, so that's kind of a tough one, because tax reform has been on the agenda for quite some time. And there were fits and starts even last year around whether or not that was going to get passed or not get passed. Part of it is we do stay very closely attuned to all legislation that's pending on the Hill, and we do begin taking early looks at sort of what the impact may be on the IRS. I'd say in this instance, this probably came together very quickly, and maybe more quickly than perhaps I think various stakeholders would have thought. But we do have a very defined process in place at the IRS when there is new legislation. So, I think we were tracking early on some of the provisions and already beginning to plan sort of what were those areas that were going to be affected.
Right. Okay, makes sense. And how about some other areas, emerging areas for you guys?
I think maybe an area that we haven't quite, got a full handle on what the impact is going to be, I think, on the tax ecosystem and on the IRS itself, but it's around the digital economy. And then I think certainly, some of the developments when we look at, like artificial intelligence and robotics, what's the impact that's going to be on the workforce, on business activity, on the tax system? And I think those are areas where we know that's got implications for the IRS, but I think we're going to need some help there in really understanding, what are the risks in the short term and I think longer term. Another area where it's an emerged risk, but where it's evolving in a way that we have to continuously stay attuned to it, is in the area of identity theft. And I think, the IRS, working with partners in, the state tax administration and the financial services community, has done a lot to try to reduce and address, identity theft as it relates to individuals. But now what we see is it's moving over to business identity theft, and also shifting to our partners, tax preparers, who, have been victims of scams and phishing, events that have actually compromised, data that they maintain on taxpayers. So, once you sort of make it difficult in one area for the criminals, they move on to another area. And so that's something where we've always got to look at where's the next place they're likely to go if we make it, if we shut it down here.
Right. And that actually brings up a topic, cybersecurity in general. I mean, the hackers are trying to get in and get our data, and every federal agency has to worry about this, of course, every company, every individual. But, is the IRS particularly susceptible or, a greater risk than other agencies for this?
Well, I think the IRS is a particularly attractive target because we issue refunds. So there's a monetary incentive for criminals to try and compromise the IRS. I think we've been fortunate because of the defenses and the investments that we've made in cyber that we've not, our actual systems themselves have not been compromised. But the challenge that we've had is that we we rely on, giving taxpayers access to information, access to their accounts in order to file their returns, obtain refunds, make payments, etc. And tying back to the earlier item on identity theft, so much information now is out there on all of us that it's made it, relatively easy for fraudsters to compile enough information to actually authenticate as the taxpayer. And I think that's what we've really been challenged by, is how do we make sure that we're dealing with the legitimate taxpayer and actually issuing refunds to the right party.
Right, and actually brings up my thought, there was also a little glitch that happened right around filing time this year, we heard about in the news and all that, and it kind of goes to response, how do you guys respond to this and things like potential hacks? How's your responsiveness of it?
Well, so the IRS, I think, has a very rapid response, process or approach. We do have sort of a handbook on how to marshal our people and our resources when there is any type of event. And I think if you look back at sort of the hardware glitch that occurred on the last day of filing season, the IRS was able to identify that problem very quickly, bring the right people together, and really within about 12 hours, the system was back up and fully operational, and we had processed over 14 million returns that had come in, while the system was not fully operational. So, I think that points to the importance of having a really good risk response plan, and I think just being resilient, because things are going to happen, and, hardware glitch, I'm not sure how, a risk assessment or risk model is actually going to prevent all types of hardware failures, but I think the key is then, if something does happen, what's your ability to quickly respond and address? Right.
I'm a little curious, just a little bit of the nitty gritty on risk responses. So, what is the mechanism? Do you all identify an area and then potential responses to it, and then what is the next actual step? You do guidelines, or do you do some kind of if this happens, then kind of scenario? What's the, sort of the?
Well, it's a mix, Paul. I mean, you have to look at, first of all, what's the impact of the risk were it to occur, and is the leadership team comfortable? For example, are we willing to accept the risk if it occurs, or is this something that we're not willing to accept, and we either need to put in place mitigants to further reduce the likelihood? Right. Is it something that we're going to stop doing because we're just so uncomfortable with the risk that it presents? Or in some areas, can we transfer the risk or share the risk? Is there a way for us to perhaps get out of this business, move it into a third party? How do we perhaps lessen the impact of the risk on the IRS? But in those instances where for example, in delivering our core services, there are going to be risks associated with trying to achieve that. The key is then, what are some of the tools that we can implement to actually reduce the likelihood of the risk occurring? So that might be more investment, more monitoring, again, bringing in additional staffing, for example. And then the other piece of that too is just, being sure that you've got a very good response plan in place so that if something does happen, that you're equipped to rapidly address it.
Great. Well, so everybody knows taxes is something many people are passionate about, opinion-wise, and it's an area, if the IRS, has had things come up in the news and over the years, and is it hard to kind of maintain momentum for risk management with kind of all these things coming up, or political battles going on, or how do you guys maintain momentum?
Yeah, I think it can be a challenge in the environment where it seems like everything has become so politicized. But, what I would say has been, I think, valuable for us is the leadership at the IRS, including our past commissioner and our acting commissioner, I think have been very focused on keeping the agency focused on, our mission, and tried to be very positive in their outlook. And I think trying to separate sort of the political environment that we're in from the day-to-day mission that we are all, I think, focused on delivering. So I'd say that makes a big difference, is the leadership, and how do you keep people sort of keep their mind on the day-to-day work and try to draw that distinction between what's happening in the environment around us. What happens though is it does create an environment where people are going to be a bit more risk adverse. Mm-hmm. And I think that's partly because in the federal space and the government space, anything that goes wrong probably gets more attention than it would perhaps in other areas. Right. And so even though anytime you want to innovate, you have to pilot and you have to test, I'm not sure there's a lot of room in the federal government for failure. And failure is just a byproduct of, I think, innovation and trying new things. But we don't probably have as much space there, and that's where probably coming up with a really good risk plan is important, because if you see something that is going off course, it gives you the capability to perhaps come up with options and solutions before maybe we get too far down that road. So I think ERM type activities, good risk management practices, can help organizations innovate, but it is a bit of a challenge, I think, in the federal space, just because there's so much scrutiny and I think so much focus on when things do go wrong.
Right, absolutely. And I am curious. I think you guys will have a new commissioner come in a little while, sometime soon here. And when a new commissioner comes in, how do you all basically establish the credibility of your program, what you're doing, so that the new commissioner will be on board, or
Yeah, that's an important point, and I think that the impact of the top leadership on risk culture and on ERM is significant, and I think that really is the key element in an agency's overall approach to risk, is how does the leadership view the importance of, I think, sharing information and I think getting ahead of risks. I think the way that we've been able to demonstrate, or can demonstrate, the value equation is to point out how it can help the agency deliver on the mission.
Right.
And of course, all the political appointees come in with a specific charge they want to accomplish and deliver, for the administration and for in our case, for the taxpayer. So we're able to demonstrate how good risk management practices can actually increase the likelihood of success in delivering the mission, but I think more importantly in this environment as well, increase the likelihood of success for the new commissioner, himself or herself, by giving them a tool to actually identify where things could go wrong, and I think equipping us with the capacity to either address things before they do go wrong, or again, just be better prepared to have the opportunity ahead of time, perhaps, to address any challenges that we might see.
Right. And then I was wondering, when new leaders come in, I would assume, depending on their agenda or what they're trying to do, there's going to be different perspectives on what they consider to be risks. What's their appetite, higher or lower than a previous administration? So how flexible are you guys to that? And also, are there risks that are always going to be risks, no matter who's coming in?
Well, yeah, I think, for example, the cyber risk, identity theft, some of the compliance challenges, that's always going to be part of, risk to the tax system, I assume.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the difference is that, leadership will have different risk appetites. There's some areas where they may be willing to push the envelope a bit for IRS to get out in front in some areas. Mm-hmm. Or, again, depending on what their specific charge is, what their background is, what their areas of expertise are, they might have a different view on things that perhaps we need to be a bit more risk sensitive about, right? So I think that's the great thing about an ERM, and particularly the way it's been established within the federal space, is it's been done in a way to give flexibility. Mm-hmm. It's not been pushed out as a one-size-fits-all. It has been set out with a set of standards and I think some principles, but there is flexibility for organizations to implement that in a way that works best for them, and again, that allows it to be adaptable, so that as leadership changes and as risk appetites change, and I think as the priorities of organizations change, the risk management program can adapt to support any of those approaches.
Right. No, I would think so. When the new commissioner comes in, his or her staff as well, I'm sure you guys are going to look at what's on your risks list plan right now, so to speak, and some things might drop off, some things might increase or decrease.
Yeah, I think any leader coming into a new organization would want to get a sense of what are the areas of opportunity, mm-hmm. number one, but then what are those areas that I need to watch out for, where we may have particular risks. And so I think, again, any leader is going to want to see what that information is. I think that's what the value of having an updated and timely sort of risk register for an organization can provide to new leadership. But then again, their view of what may be the top risks may be different from their predecessor. And again, I think it's
right.
based on their own experience, their expertise, and I think sort of what their charge is.
Right. Well, let's talk about the funding here, because budgets are always getting cut, obviously, and how have you all dealt with that as far as risk management's concerned? In order to you're doing less with more, that kind of maxim, but what are some innovative things that you all have had to do because you had budget cuts?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. The first risk assessment that we did at the IRS back in 2014 identified budget as one of the top risk areas because we were experiencing, significant cuts which have continued for the last several years. It's, I wouldn't say that this is a term that's one that we would want all organizations to have to experience, but we've almost viewed budget now as becoming a foundational risk because it's just become so prevalent across, I think, all of government, given the challenges we have from a budgetary perspective. But what that has done is it has forced us, I think, to implement, to streamline processes, to streamline approaches, and to make, I think, changes in the way we deliver services and the way we do our work that have made processes more efficient. But I think on the flip side of that, those constraints also have, I think, delayed the ability of the IRS to actually make transformational changes because, again, making a process change requires investment. And when you're dealing with the scale of the budget cuts that the IRS, I think, has experienced, and you're looking at, how do we keep the phone lines open and how do we continue to enforce the tax law and how do we make sure we're providing guidance, trying to balance, all those needs with our cyber needs, for example, and then continue to innovate, I think it does cause us to actually find those areas where we can make the incremental improvements, but it does make it difficult, I think, to actually invest in those transformational changes, which need a long-term commitment. And that's something in the federal space that, I think is particularly challenging for us, is that it's very difficult to get long-term commitments to transformational change.
Right, absolutely. Well, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about your time at another organization. I understand you used to work at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And they also have a forum, what is it? I'm sorry. The
Forum on Tax Administration.
That's it, FTA.
Yeah.
And can you tell us a little bit about that organization and what they do and also kind of what you learned as far as risks for taxes across the world, basically?
Yeah, I mean, that was a really unique opportunity. The U.S. is a part of the OECD, and the IRS has been actively involved with the work of the OECD for, as long as I've been at the agency, and I've had opportunities to represent the IRS at meetings of and work that's done by the OECD. So when the opportunity arose for me to actually go work at the OECD and with the Forum on Tax Administration in 2016, I saw that as just a really good time for me to actually learn more about what's happening in other tax administrations. And we have about 50 countries that actually are part of the Forum on Tax Administration. And so by being, I think, a part of that body for over a year, I was able to get some insight into the specific risks that other tax administrations are faced with, and then more importantly, what are some of the approaches that they've taken to try to, I think, address and mitigate. So not surprisingly, we share many of the top risks. Human resources challenges is a top risk for most tax administrations. Cyber risk, I think is pretty common across tax compliance risk, et cetera. So it's helpful to see where we've got common areas of risk, and then also, learning what is each country doing to address that, and how can we perhaps share some of those experiences with other tax administrations. And that's something that the Forum on Tax Administration, which it's the tax commissioners of about 50 countries that form that body. That's one of the key benefits that I think they gain from that, is really understanding what have other tax agencies done, and then what can we apply, for example, back in our own tax administration.
So did you see some tangible things, responses or things that you could implement?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, again, looking in the area of some of the tax compliance challenges in particular, and also service. I mean, you can look at what's happened in some of the Nordic countries, and then certainly in some of the areas, whether it's Australia or New Zealand, where they've made significant advances in the way that they deliver service to taxpayers that we can, I think, learn from. I think the other area, too, is in the whole international tax landscape now. There's such an interconnectedness of tax, and particularly with the ability to shift resources or shift assets throughout the world, it does require sort of a coordinated approach to tax compliance. And I think that's something that the OECD and the FTA, of course, have been very focused on for the last 5 to 10 years, is providing this coordinated framework to addressing tax compliance, because it doesn't help, for example, for one tax administration to put in place provisions that are just going to drive non-compliance, somewhere else, because at the end of the day, I think all tax administrations get impacted by that.
Right. And actually, just briefly, because that brings up the what is it, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act?
Oh, right, right.
Just curious what you guys, that's on your list of to-dos as well, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, the FATCA's been in place now for, gosh, more than 5 years, and I
Mm-hmm.
think the IRS has done a great job in getting the system set up and working with the financial institutions, throughout the world and other countries, and I think signing the treaty provisions, and I think putting in the mechanics so that information on assets that U.S. citizens have abroad can be reported to the U.S. And the work that the U.S. did in this space actually then led to an overall reporting system now that's in place, I think, worldwide, and particularly for all of the countries that are in the OECD's. Working with the base erosion profit shifting initiative within the OECD, where there's now a common reporting system. And so it's not just the U.S. FATCA, but now there's actually reporting, I think, for most tax administrations now, which gives insight again into where are assets being shifted, and how can that actually help all tax administrations, I think, get a handle on overall compliance.
Okay, yeah, very interesting. Well, I wanted to kind of have one more question for you. So you are the president-elect for AFERM, the Association for Federal Enterprise Risk Management.
Right.
So I'm curious to see what, actually two questions, what do you see are some of the biggest challenges coming up right now for federal agencies in general, and then also just maybe some, advice or feedback for other agencies trying to get to that maturity level you guys are at. So.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, first of all, I'm excited to be serving as the president-elect and actually have the opportunity to work with the federal community on risk management, because I do personally just see so much value that can be gained out of having in place an effective, I think, risk management program. The challenge, of course, in the environment we're in today is that everybody is strapped for resources and time. Mm-hmm. And so there can be a view that, I'm too busy. And if you not really have a good sense of what ERM is and sort of what it can provide for an organization, I think there can be a view that that's something we don't have time for. But the flip side of that is, by not doing risk management, organizations are more likely to suffer crises. Right. And then what happens is, then you have to, whether you'd like to or not, you then have to deploy crisis management. Right. And we have far too many examples, and the IRS has its own, of where we've actually had crises that probably could have been prevented through good risk management programs. And then you look at the time and the resources spent addressing the crisis, you could have spent far fewer resources and a lot less time, I think, in practicing good risk management. So I think it's trying to just point out the value that risk management can have to organizations, and also getting people to recognize that we're not doing it, or you shouldn't do it just because OMB has updated the circular, for example. And so even though that has prompted, I think, a lot of organizations to look at ERM, and we welcome and appreciate that, that shouldn't be the main driving factor. The main driving factor should be recognizing the value that ERM can provide, and then seeing how that can actually help, I think, increase, again, the likelihood of success of your organization, and I think your agency delivering on its mission. But then personally, for all of us as leaders in government, for us to increase the likelihood of our own personal success and being able to achieve, the objectives that we want to accomplish in our roles in government. So I see a lot of value that can be gained from ERM and from good risk management practices if people can sort of look at that side of the equation and not get too caught up in perhaps some of the process side of ERM.
Right. Okay, well, thanks, Tom, for joining us today. I learned a lot and appreciate you giving us your story from the IRS and from other organizations, and we look forward to hearing more.
Great. Well, Paul, thanks again for the opportunity. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, that's our show. Thanks again for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed it. We have several upcoming shows this year planned. We'll be speaking to various federal ERM thought leaders, risk professionals, chief risk officers. I think there'll be plenty of interesting topics for everybody. So until then, this is Paul Marshall signing off, and I hope you'll join us again soon for the next